Imagine a boy so frail, so starved, that his fragile body couldn't keep up with the demands of life. Imagine a family desperate for salvation, yet trapped in a cycle of poverty that offered none. Now, imagine that boy's heart stopping, not once, not twice, but 3 times. Each time, his journey seemed to end, but each time, he returned, bringing with him a message that could only come from a place beyond our earthly understanding. This is the story of Samuel, a boy who ventured beyond death's veil and came back to warn us all. Samuel was just 5 years old, but his body bore the signs of a lifetime of struggle. His family lived in a rundown home on the edge of a town long forgotten by prosperity. The peeling paint on the walls and the cold drafts that seeped through the cracks in the windows mirrored the hopelessness of their situation. Samuel's father worked tirelessly in a factory, earning barely enough to keep the family afloat, while his mother scavenged for scraps to piece together meager meals. Despite their efforts, Samuel's thin frame and hollow cheeks spoke volumes about the sacrifices they all endured. He was a quiet boy, his strength slowly sapped by hunger. The games he once played with his younger siblings now left him winded, and his bright eyes dulled with exhaustion. His body, starved of essential nutrients, began to betray him in small but telling ways. His once strong voice became a whisper, his steps faltered, and his laughter faded into silence. One fateful evening, as the family gathered around a meager dinner, Samuel collapsed. His mother screamed, her voice raw with panic, as his small body convulsed before going eerily still. His father carried him to the nearest clinic, their desperation outweighing the bleak knowledge that they couldn't afford the treatment he needed. At the clinic, under flickering fluorescent lights, the doctors did everything they could. But Samuel's malnourished heart was too weak to fight. His breathing slowed to a shallow gasp, then stopped altogether. The room fell silent, save for the beeping monitor that announced the unthinkable. Samuel was gone. His mother's cries shattered the stillness. She clung to his lifeless body, refusing to believe what the doctors had confirmed. His father, stoic in his grief, stood motionless, his eyes brimming with tears he wouldn't let fall. Samuel's siblings huddled together, their innocence forever marred by the loss of their brother. But Samuel's story was far from over. As Samuel's body grew cold, a strange sensation overtook him. It was as though he were floating, the weight of his frail body slipping away. The desperate cries of his family faded into the distance, replaced by an all-encompassing silence. His consciousness, untethered and free, drifted into a darkness deeper than anything he could have imagined. The journey was slow and surreal. The void around him seemed alive, pulsating with an eerie energy that pressed against him from all sides. He wasn't afraid at first, just disoriented, but the silence soon gave way to whispers. They came from nowhere and everywhere, fragmented voices that spoke in a language he didn't understand but somehow felt. Their tone was urgent, almost accusatory, as though they were preparing him for something he wasn't ready to face. Suddenly, the darkness shifted. Shadows began to coalesce around him, their shapes fluid and indistinct. Samuel tried to focus, but the figures were elusive, always just beyond clarity. They moved closer, their presence oppressive yet strangely magnetic. He couldn't run, he couldn't hide. He could only watch as they surrounded him. Then, as if on cue, the shadows parted, revealing a surreal landscape. It was neither earth nor heaven, but something in between, a realm of muted colors and an atmosphere heavy with tension. The ground beneath him felt strange, as though it were alive, and the air was thick with a chill that seeped into his very essence. He could feel eyes on him, unseen yet undeniable. From the mist, figures emerged. They weren't human, but neither were they completely otherworldly. Their translucent forms flickered, and their faces were obscured, yet their presence was undeniable. One by one, they spoke, their voices resonating in his mind like the tolling of a distant bell. Samuel, one intoned, "You are here for a reason. What you will see cannot be undone." Another figure stepped forward, its form radiating sorrow. "You must prepare. The truth will shake you, and it will not be gentle." The whispers grew louder, their words incomprehensible, but filled with meaning that Samuel felt in his very soul. He wanted to ask questions, to understand why he was here, but his voice seemed lost in the overwhelming presence of the realm. Then, without warning, he felt a pull, a force dragging him further into the unknown. The figures faded, their cryptic warnings echoing in the void. Samuel was alone again, the weight of their words pressing on him like a heavy shroud. The pale light ahead grew brighter, and he knew he was being drawn towards something far greater than himself. His journey into the beyond was only beginning. Samuel was pulled forward, his spirit propelled by a force he couldn't resist. The pale light ahead grew blinding, wrapping around him like a cocoon. For a moment, he felt weightless, as though the burdens of his earthly body and life had been left behind entirely. But the peace was fleeting. The light gave way to a vast expanse of shimmering emptiness, where the air was heavy with a presence he could feel before he could see it. And then he appeared. A figure emerged from the radiance, glowing with an otherworldly brilliance that defied human understanding. It was unmistakably Jesus. His form was both human and divine, his features serene, yet filled with a power that made Samuel's soul tremble. But what struck Samuel most wasn't the radiance or the grandeur. It was the expression on Jesus' face. It wasn't the gentle, comforting gaze of the Savior Samuel had imagined. Instead, Jesus' eyes carried a somber weight, a mixture of sorrow and urgency. The atmosphere was unlike anything Samuel expected. It wasn't the serene, golden paradise he had heard about in church. The air here felt thick with purpose, as though every molecule was charged with the weight of something greater than himself. The light that surrounded Jesus seemed to pulse with life, but the space was devoid of the joyful peace Samuel thought heaven would hold. Instead, it was filled with an intensity that made his spirit quiver. Jesus stepped closer, his voice resonating not in Samuel's ears, but within his very being. "Samuel," he said, his tone steady but heavy with meaning, "you have been brought here not for comfort, but for truth." Samuel's thoughts raced, his small spirit overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. Why now? He tried to speak, but no words would come. It didn't matter. Jesus seemed to know his thoughts. "You have seen the suffering in your life," Jesus continued. "You know hunger, pain, and loss. But your journey does not end here. You have been chosen to carry a message that cannot wait." Samuel felt a wave of emotion rise within him. He wanted to ask what this message was, why he had been chosen, but the questions dissolved under the intensity of Jesus' gaze. "You will see," Jesus said, his voice tinged with sadness. "And when you return, you must speak. The world has forgotten its purpose, and the consequences of its actions are near." Jesus raised his hand, and the radiant light around him dimmed. In its place, images began to form, a series of visions that filled the space around Samuel. Each one was more harrowing than the last, their meaning sinking deep into his spirit. "The world is crumbling," Jesus said, his voice filled with sorrow. "Humanity has strayed far from the path of compassion and love. Apathy has taken root, and suffering has become invisible to those who should care most." In the first vision, Samuel saw a sprawling city, its streets lined with people. But no one looked at each other. Faces were blank, eyes glued to screens, while the homeless and hungry sat unnoticed in the shadows. The air was heavy with despair, yet the people seemed oblivious to the suffering around them. "The indifference of the many is the greatest sin of this age," Jesus said. "It blinds the heart and silences the soul." The vision shifted. Samuel saw mountains being leveled, oceans choking with waste, and forests consumed by fire. Animals fled in terror as their homes were destroyed. The earth groaned under the weight of humanity's greed, its beauty scarred by the relentless pursuit of wealth. "Greed has poisoned the world," Jesus continued, his voice growing heavier. "The gifts of creation have been squandered, and the cries of the earth are drowned out by the clamor for more." The next vision chilled Samuel to his core. He saw a sea of faces, men, women, and children, reaching out, their eyes filled with desperation. But their pleas were met with closed doors and turnbacks. The vulnerable were left to suffer, their lives deemed unworthy of help. To neglect the least among you is to neglect me, Jesus said, his voice filled with pain. Humanity's apathy toward the vulnerable will be its undoing. Finally, the visions culminated in an image of fire and ash. Cities collapsed, the earth split open, and the skies darkened. Samuel could hear the cries of millions, their voices filled with regret and terror. The destruction was total, and it was clear this was a world that had ignored its warning. Jesus turned to Samuel, his eyes filled with both sorrow and hope. "But it is not too late," he said. "You have seen what awaits if humanity does not change. You must tell them, Samuel. Tell them to turn back to compassion, to faith, to love. This is your mission." Samuel felt the weight of the task settle on him like a heavy cloak. He didn't understand why he had been chosen, but he knew he couldn't refuse. Jesus placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, and a warmth spread through him, an anchor against the fear. "Go now," Jesus said, his voice both commanding and kind. "Speak the truth, no matter who listens. The world depends on it." With that, the visions faded, and Samuel felt himself being pulled back. But the images and words burned in his soul, a constant reminder of the mission he had been given. Samuel felt the warmth and comfort of Jesus' presence fade, replaced by a suffocating coldness that seemed to creep into his very soul. The light that had surrounded him moments before gave way to shadows, and an ominous pull dragged him downward. He didn't want to go, but he couldn't resist the force drawing him deeper into the void. Jesus' voice, steady yet sorrowful, echoed around him. "You must see, Samuel. You must understand the weight of what happens when the warnings are ignored." The descent began. The air grew thick with a putrid stench that made Samuel's stomach churn. The faint sound of moans and wails rose in the distance, growing louder with every moment. Shadows writhed and twisted around him, forming grotesque shapes that seemed alive with malice. As he descended further, the darkness gave way to a fiery abyss. Before him stretched an endless expanse of torment. Souls were trapped in horrifying contortions, their bodies twisted in ways that defied nature. Flames licked at their forms, but they did not burn clean. Instead, they seemed to intensify the suffering, a cycle without end. The screams of agony filled the air, a cacophony of regret and despair that pierced Samuel's very spirit. Jesus stood beside him, his expression heavy with sorrow. "These are the consequences of choices made in life," he said. "Here, there is no escape, no relief." Samuel's eyes widened as he saw the faces of the tormented. Some wept openly, their hands reaching upward as if begging for mercy. Others clung to material objects, gold, jewels, possessions, only to have them melt away in their hands, leaving nothing but ash and emptiness. These were the greedy, those who had pursued wealth and power at the expense of others. In another corner of the abyss, Samuel saw souls consumed by their own anger. They fought one another endlessly, their hands bloodied and their faces twisted with rage. Each time one soul seemed to overpower another, they would dissolve into shadow, only to reappear and start the cycle again. These were the souls who had let hatred define them in life. Samuel's heart pounded as he tried to turn away, but the images followed him. Everywhere he looked, there was suffering. The sights were unbearable, yet he couldn't close his eyes. Tears streamed down his face as he felt the sheer hopelessness of those trapped in this place. "Why are you showing me this?" Samuel cried, his voice trembling. "Why must I see this?" Jesus placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Because they didn't listen. They ignored the truth, lived for themselves, and turned away from love and compassion. You must help others avoid this fate." Samuel's legs gave way, and he fell to his knees. The enormity of what he was witnessing, the suffering, the finality, was too much to bear. He clutched his chest, his small frame shaking with sobs. He wanted to leave, to escape the nightmare, but he knew it wasn't over. Samuel felt a hand lift him from the ground, steadying him. Jesus knelt before him, his eyes filled with compassion and understanding. "I know this is difficult," Jesus said softly, "but this is why you've been brought here. You have a mission, Samuel." The glow around Jesus intensified, casting away the lingering shadows. For the first time, Samuel felt a faint sense of calm returning to his spirit, though the weight of what he had seen still pressed heavily on him. "Your task is to return to the world and share what you've witnessed," Jesus continued. "Tell them of the suffering you've seen, the fate that awaits those who turn away from love, compassion, and faith." Samuel's voice was small, trembling. "Why me? I'm just a boy. How can I make them listen? How can I change anything?" Jesus' expression softened, and he placed both hands on Samuel's shoulders. "Because your voice will carry truth, and truth has power. You don't need to change everyone, Samuel. You only need to speak. The rest is in their hands." Samuel's mind raced. The thought of returning, of carrying such a heavy burden, seemed impossible. The weight of responsibility crushed his resolve. "But what if they don't believe me? What if they mock me or turn away?" Jesus smiled gently, his warmth radiating reassurance. "Even if only one heart is changed, it will be worth it, and you won't be alone. My Spirit will be with you, guiding you, giving you strength." Samuel looked into Jesus' eyes and felt an overwhelming sense of peace, a calm that he couldn't explain. It didn't erase his fear, but it gave him the courage to nod. "I'll try," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do what you ask." Jesus stood, his radiant figure glowing brighter. "That is all I ask. Go now, Samuel. Speak the truth, no matter the cost. The world needs to hear, and you have been chosen to deliver this message." With those words, the light around Jesus intensified, enveloping Samuel completely. He felt himself being pulled upward, away from the abyss and the visions of torment. But the images and the weight of his mission stayed with him, etched into his soul. As the glow consumed him, Samuel heard Jesus' final words echo in his mind. "The time is short. Speak, and let them choose their path." Samuel closed his eyes, ready to return to a world that would never be the same. Samuel felt himself falling, tumbling through a tunnel of light and warmth. The pull was relentless, dragging him from the ethereal realms back to the world he had left behind. His body felt heavy, as though it were a distant shell calling him home. The warmth faded, replaced by a coldness that jolted him awake. The first sensation was pain, a dull ache coursing through his small frame. Then came the sound of hurried footsteps, frantic voices, and gasps of disbelief. Samuel's eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the blinding glare of hospital lights. He blinked, confused, as the sterile world around him came into focus. "His pulse, it's back," a nurse exclaimed, her voice filled with astonishment. "He's breathing." The doctors and nurses, who moments ago had been preparing to call time of death, now rushed to his bedside. Their expressions were a mixture of shock and disbelief. One of them reached for his wrist, checking his pulse again, as though the reality of his revival was too impossible to accept. In the corner of the room, Samuel's mother fell to her knees, her hands clasped together as tears streamed down her face. "Thank you, God," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you for bringing him back." His father, normally stoic, stood frozen, his eyes wide with wonder. Slowly, he approached the bed, hesitant as though afraid this miracle might vanish if he came too close. Samuel's gaze shifted toward his parents. His eyes, once dull and lifeless, now held a depth that seemed far beyond his years. When he spoke, his voice was soft but steady, filled with a weight that silenced the chaos around him. "I saw him," Samuel said, his words carrying an authority that belied his small frame. "I saw Jesus." The room fell silent. The medical staff exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of the boy's declaration. His parents leaned in closer, their faces a mixture of awe and confusion. "There's something I have to tell you," Samuel continued, his voice trembling slightly. "It's important. Everyone needs to hear it. The light in his eyes and the solemnity in his tone left no doubt. Samuel had returned, but he was no longer the same boy who had left. Whatever he had experienced on the other side, it had transformed him completely. The first time Samuel shared his story, it was with his family. His mother and father sat beside him, their faces etched with a mixture of love, fear, and curiosity. His siblings huddled nearby, their wide eyes fixed on him. The room was still, the air heavy with anticipation. Samuel began slowly, recounting the moments after his death. The darkness, the journey, the radiant presence of Jesus, and the terrifying glimpse of hell. As he spoke, his voice trembled, but his words were clear. Every detail was etched in his mind as though branded there by fire. His mother clutched her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks. "My son," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You've seen so much." His father, skeptical but visibly shaken, pressed him. "Samuel, how do you know it was real? How can we be sure?" Samuel's answer was calm but unwavering. "Because it wasn't a dream. It wasn't my imagination. It was the truth, and I have to share it. People need to know." At first, his family struggled to fully grasp the gravity of what he was saying. But as the days passed, Samuel's conviction never wavered. He began to share his story with neighbors and friends, each retelling stirring reactions of shock, awe, and sometimes skepticism. Word spread quickly. Soon, Samuel's small town was buzzing with talk of the boy who had returned from the dead. Local pastors invited him to their churches, where he stood before small congregations, recounting his experience. He spoke of the suffering he saw, the warning Jesus had given him, and the urgent need for humanity to change its ways. Many listened in rapt attention, their eyes filling with tears as Samuel's words struck deep. Some doubted, offering skeptical smiles or outright dismissal. "It's just a hallucination," one man muttered after a sermon. "The boy's been through trauma." But even the skeptics couldn't deny the sincerity in Samuel's voice or the wisdom far beyond his years. His descriptions of the afterlife were too vivid, too detailed, to be dismissed so easily. The local news caught wind of his story, and soon Samuel found himself speaking to larger crowds. Churches filled beyond capacity as people flocked to hear him. His small voice carried a powerful message: to embrace love, compassion, and faith before it was too late. For Samuel, the burden of his mission weighed heavily on his young shoulders. He didn't always understand why he had been chosen, but he knew he couldn't stop. His warning wasn't just a story. It was a call to action, one that carried the weight of eternity. And though he faced doubt and criticism, Samuel pressed on, driven by the urgency of the message he had been sent to deliver. At first, Samuel's story inspired awe and curiosity. People flocked to hear the boy who had returned from death with a message from Jesus himself. But as his story spread, so did the scrutiny. Doubts began to creep in, whispered among those who had come to listen. "It's too far-fetched," one man muttered as he left a gathering. "It's just a child's imagination. He's been through trauma," another woman said dismissively. "This is his mind trying to cope." Samuel was too young to fully understand the weight of public criticism, but he could feel it. Reporters began showing up at his appearances, cameras rolling, their questions pointed and skeptical. "Do you really believe you saw Jesus?" one journalist asked. "Or could this be a dream or hallucination caused by your medical condition?" Samuel tried to answer, his voice steady but tinged with hurt. "I know what I saw. It wasn't a dream. It was real." The more Samuel shared, the more he faced resistance. Social media lit up with debates, with some praising him as a divine messenger and others mocking him as a deluded child. The ridicule began to take a toll. Samuel would sit in his small room at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was strong enough to carry this burden. "Why me, Jesus?" he whispered into the darkness. "Why would you choose someone so small, someone who's struggling, just to be heard?" But in his moments of doubt, there were voices of encouragement. His mother remained his constant pillar, her unwavering belief in his mission lifting him during his darkest hours. "You've been given this task for a reason," she told him, clasping his hand. "God doesn't make mistakes." A local pastor, who had initially been skeptical, became one of his strongest allies. After hearing Samuel speak, the pastor admitted to feeling a deep conviction he couldn't ignore. "You are the voice we need," he said, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Keep going, Samuel. The world needs to hear what you have to say." These moments of support gave Samuel the strength to press on. Though the criticism never ceased, he learned to focus on the lives he was touching, the hearts that were opening. "If I can reach even one person," he told himself, "it will all be worth it." Samuel's story had grown far beyond his small town. News outlets picked up his testimony, and soon he was invited to speak at churches, conferences, and events across the country. Videos of his speeches went viral, reaching people in countries he had never heard of. In the months that followed, stories began pouring in: letters, emails, and calls from people whose lives had been changed by his message. A man from another state wrote about how Samuel's warning had led him to reconcile with his estranged family. A woman who had been on the brink of despair found renewed hope in his words. Churches reported record attendances, with people coming back to faith after hearing the boy's story. Despite the growing fame, Samuel remained humble. He knew this wasn't about him. It was about the message he carried. "I'm just a messenger," he often said. "The warning is what matters." The transformation Samuel witnessed wasn't just in others. It was in himself. He grew from a frail, unsure boy into a confident speaker, his words resonating with conviction far beyond his years. He spoke not just with the voice of a child, but with the authority of someone who had seen and understood the eternal stakes. His final plea became his most powerful message. Standing before a crowd of thousands, his voice clear and unwavering, he said, "I was given a second chance so that I could tell you this. Love one another. Care for the vulnerable. Turn away from the things that destroy your soul." Jesus doesn't want you to live in fear. He wants you to live with purpose. But the time to act is now. The time is short. The crowd sat in stunned silence, his words hanging in the air. Many wept openly, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe, hope, and determination. Samuel's legacy endured long after the spotlight faded. His story became a symbol of redemption and the power of faith. Communities around the world took his message to heart, organizing acts of service and compassion. Skeptics softened, inspired by the undeniable sincerity of his testimony. In the end, Samuel had done what he was called to do. He had delivered the warning, planting seeds of change in countless hearts. As he looked back on his journey, he felt peace, not because the world was perfect, but because he had fulfilled his mission. His final words in the script echoed across the screen as it faded to black. "Don't wait for tomorrow to choose love, compassion, and faith. Today is your chance to make the world better. Don't waste it." Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even more insane.